Okay, this is Bhodi Timms. I am the program director for the Herbal Product Design Masters and the Cannabis Science Post-Baccalaureate Certificate Program. And welcome everybody. We are going to have a conversation around designing herbal products to build resilience. In both those programs, one of the final courses, you actually sort of work on this. We'll leave room for conversations. You can see on the right-hand side a number of adaptogens. And then on the left, this image of sort of connection. Because traditionally, resilience has just been focused on physical resilience, but I'm a big believer in community being part of resilience as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a brief conversation around stress, burnout, and how adaptation to the forces that cause that can be good or they can be detrimental. A very brief conversation around what resilience might look like, how it's defined. We'll look at wild versus tame food. Herbs, herbal medicine is in the wild side, as you might guess. We're going to look at several examples of phytochemical adaptogens from different systems, herbal systems, approaches. And then what I'll do is I'll review 2 herbs for a resilience formula. I'll do one in depth to have a little bit about a conversation around the nature of primary peer-reviewed research, its role in justifying a formulary. And the second one where I'll provide you a little bit of evidence. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you all to help me choose the third. And then we'll end up with just a review of all the things that you need to think about when you're making a product. This is sort of an outline of what we end up engaging in our formulary courses so that you can begin to see the extent to which we dive into all the components of product design. If you have questions, use the chat box or the Q&A. I'll keep an eye out on those. If it's something that is going to come up in the talk, I may just pass by and you'll see that it's answered. If it's something that maybe is external to the talk, I'll just stop and we can engage in that conversation. So let's get started. So stress, right? Everyone here has undergone stress. If you haven't, please raise your hand. And then we're all going to throw tomatoes at you because we won't believe you. And so chronic, uncontrolled psychological or even physical stress is not good for us. But we do have stress all the time, right? We have intermittent fasting. We have exercise that we do. We go to take classes in an academic setting or non-academic setting to learn, and that can be its own form of stress, right? So these are things that are fairly mild. They allow us to adapt, and they're good for our system. But when we want to talk about resilience, there are numbers of them, right? And the colored ones are the ones that are sort of normally spoken of, the little colored squares: genetic, epigenetic, psychological, developmental, neurochemical, functional neural circuitry. These are things get spoken of in terms of adaptation to stress and resilience factors. I threw in a couple more. One was community, and then the bottom is phytochemicals. And that's going to be largely the focus of this talk, because that's what our focus is on in terms of the product development. So when we talk about wild versus tame food, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans started to transition to agriculture. Before that, we literally were wildcrafters. We understood that the forest and the plants around us in our native ecosystem provided food, provided medicine, provided, cordage, all kinds of things. So early humans were exposed to anywhere between 80 to 220,000 phytochemicals in their diet, very rich. And by early humans, I'm talking about the full arc of human evolution. And that means that we co-evolved with these plants and we co-evolved with the phytochemicals. Our biological systems are set up in order to treat what we call exogenous compounds that come from outside. And our system is set up to handle those, to absorb, transition them into the waste stream and to get rid of them. But in the meantime, they end up passing through the blood. They potentially have toxic effects or they have healing effects. Well, now what we've done is we've simplified our exposure and we're down to about 10,000 phytochemicals. And so we have about 2,500 domesticated plants that have reduced secondary metabolites. These are the phytochemicals that are of medicinal interest. And the example here is the Brassica family. And this is the Brassica genus. These are all cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli. These all originate from a common wild mustard. If you've ever eaten wild mustard, it's got a bit of a bite to it. It's rich in phytochemicals. And, you know, early humans and folks who are still going out and using plants from the wild to a great degree in different societies, they understand how to handle these plants. They maybe parboil them, or they cook them, or they dry them. And these are things that help detoxify. Because literally we simplified our exposure to the wild and tamed it to decrease the flavor, right? That hot mustardy flavor. Maybe to decrease some of the pigments, because we associated those with potential toxicity, right? That's how we would learn. We would pass on that knowledge. And obviously to reduce the toxicity of the plant. But these phytochemicals are actually really important in stress adaptation. So they enhance our neuroplasticity, our ability of the mind to adapt and to continue to be functionally alive. They can mitigate chronic diseases by activating these adaptive stress response signaling in the body. These can be antioxidants. These can be immune responses. These can be hormonal signals. They could be part of the endocannabinoid system, which is something that we're much more aware of now because of cannabis. And in general, we refer to these as having adaptogenic properties. That's a modern term, and it covers a whole bunch of activities. And you'll see, we're going to talk about some systems from other medical systems, cultural systems that are really pointing at a similar set of plants and phytochemicals from the endpoint improvement, but work slightly different. So when we go over these lists, there's going to be overlap in terms of specific herbs. We're going to find herbs that are part of TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. Maybe it's part of the Western herbal tradition. There may be herbs that are part of Ayurveda and TCM, or maybe come from native indigenous use. So when you look at these overlaps, you're going to see that a lot of herbs come from different traditions. That Western, what we call Western herbal medicine, is an amalgamation of herbal use. Basically, we've stolen the cultural knowledge of other people in order to benefit ourselves. And this goes on really across multiple cultures. But each of these different systems tends to frame resilience in a slightly different way. And the benefit to that is when we look at putting formulary together for a complex condition, there may be one or two main clinical endpoints that we're measuring and trying to alter, but there may be all kinds of secondary issues that come up. And if we know that an herb works in a certain way in one tradition, and a slightly different way in another tradition, it doesn't mean it can't do both. And so this is where we begin to understand how to apply herbs to handle a primary and a secondary condition. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these lists. So I'm going to say, wake up. And let me stop for a minute and see if there are any questions. Not seeing any pop up in the QA or the chat, so I'm just going to jump in. So adaptogens, really the term, I think, came out of Russian research, and it's been usurped in the Western herbal medicine, sort of a core feature that you see out on the consumer marketplace. And we're talking about strengthening the HPA axis, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, right, over time to build resiliency in response to negative effects of stress. So the one way to think of adaptogens is that they help us experience stress with less of a metabolic cost to us from experiencing that stress. And it can be all kinds of stress: physical stress, mental stress, emotional stress. And you can see a number of plants there. Ginseng from TCM Codenopsis, from TCM astragalus, TCM holy basil. That's from Ayurveda, ashwagandha, Ayurveda. Eleuthero, has some underpinnings, and particularly in sort of Northwest indigenous tribes. It was used a lot in Russia. Rhodiola, this is from the Tibetan landscape. Schisandra, TCM, Reishi, TCM, and licorice. This comes from any number of traditions from TCM, but it comes from old Europe. So, you've got all these herbs, and this is not all adaptogens. I'm just giving you some examples. And pay attention to how these show up in other systems and other forms of resilience building classes of herbs and how they work. So this one focuses on this HPA axis. It also works at a number of sort of stress-based responses, anything from chaperone proteins that maybe begin to dysfunction under high stress, and the adaptogens can sort of help them keep the correct folding and continue to process in the body. So immunomodulators, sorry about that, my tongue is doing its own thing right now. They help strengthen the immune system. And so here again, we see a number of TCM-based herbs, some Ayurvedic herbs. And the other thing that's become more important too, this has been an interesting point, is all through COVID, we understand that the immune system can also have a co-response, which is inflammatory. That the immune and inflammatory responses can be linked. And so now we're beginning to learn how to refine our choice of immune modulators to those that aren't going to potentially produce what we call a cytokine storm, some kind of accelerated inflammatory response, right? So now we're beginning to get a little bit more nuance in our understanding. There's a set of herbs called nervines that tend to relax the nervous system. And they can do that either by calming or stimulating. So on the calming side, or it can also act as a sedative, promoting sleep, you've got a number of herbs. Cramp bark really tends to work a lot with the musculature of around the ovaries to help with spasmodic responses. Valerian, if any of you have used it, right, will help with sleep. Same with California poppy. Milky oats, we'll see that one again. That's a very calming herb, as is skullcap, chamomile, passion flower, lavender, and even St. John's wort. On the stimulating side, you've got direct stimulation, promoting circulation, or diffuse, where you're waking the entire nervous system up. So And you can have, again, both of those. So coffee and tea are going to have caffeine. It's going to promote circulation, but it's also going to stimulate that nervous system throughout the body. Chocolate, similar. And you've got horseradish, rosemary, cayenne, prickly ash, peppermint, cola. And it's interesting, things like prickly ash are rich in a class of compounds called alkylamides, which we associate with echinacea, which is an immune stimulating herb. And both of those plants also impact the endocannabinoid system, which we now understand is throughout the body, and that cannabinoids from cannabis, some terpenes actually bind and stimulate it. And that's another area of fascinating research that's beginning to emerge, is that this underlying endocannabinoid system, if you can combine cannabis-based products with herbals, you can actually enhance the effect of one over the other, because that endocannabinoid system is underpinning, and it's found in all kinds of different tissue. And you can actually use the effect of those cannabinoids, specific cannabinoids, there to amplify or tamp down maybe responses that the herbs in your formula would actually activate. Nootropics, these are plants that support mental performance, such as cognition, memory. And again, you're going to see a lot of Ayurvedic herbs. There's Bacopa Ayurvedic. There's contemporary CBD as an isolate or as part of a cannabis chemo type, sort of a low THC, high CBD chemo type. Ginkgo, ginseng, both American and Chinese. Gotu kola, lemon balm, right? Those are all out in many of our gardens. I used to have a wolf. We had a wolf that we kept in our property a long time ago. It was a gift from a Native American friend of mine, a medicine man, who had said, "You don't understand your medicine. You need to learn about it." And Istanika was her name, sky blue eye. She had one blue eye, but she was so smart. She would use a patch of lemon balm, and she would lie among it to keep the fleas and the ticks and different biting insects away from her. And she was very proud of how good she smelled when she came in. Now here are rasayanas. These are out of Ayurvedic medicine, and they tend to enhance the quality of life by supporting a very deep, long-term rejuvenation. And so you've got Terminala chibula, Tinospora cordifolia, Embellica officinalis. Again, you would find ashwagandha, the Withania somnifera there. Here's ginkgo, again, this Gotu kola, Centella asiatica. A lot of overlap, but they take a very different approach to treating it. Again, some systems are going to have a little bit more of the magic silver bullet of pharmaceutical medicine, because our culture has infused our understanding of therapeutic responses with that kind of concept. But we want to, as herbal product designers and herbalists, we want to stay away from our own prejudice about providing a silver bullet, even if it's in herbal form, right? Because most conditions aren't going to get changed overnight. So we want to broaden our expectation in terms of how long this might take, and again, treat this as a wild food, not just as a herbal drug. There's a place for herbal drugs, and there's a place too for wild food. Yep, Erica, I'll give you some contact information at the end of this talk, okay? And then you have tonics, right? These are defined very differently in Western and Eastern herbal systems. In Western, they're referred to, you're going to see the word blood cleanser used. And that really comes out of a Thompsonian herbal tradition in the early years of the American Republic. And it came out of a number of different quarters. And it's a word that has no meaning. Herbs don't clean blood. Blood is cleaned by the liver and to some extent by the kidneys. What they're really referring to is alterative. And in that sense, what you're doing is you're altering potentially some of the, a little bit of the pH of our system. You are stimulating the body to begin to eliminate or sort of drain stasis. But these are also things that you would use to strengthen a system. So something like raspberry leaf is really good for the uterus. It's taken over long term. It can be used in a way that if you continue to take it off cycle when you finally either come to your period, the tone of the uterus is so improved that you have less dysmenorrhea. A lot of women will take this in preparation for maintaining a healthy tone of the uterus in terms of birth, if that's a desired end goal. Dandelion, the root itself, is really good for the digestive system. You find dandelion down where my family's from, which is Biloxi, New Orleans area. You've got roasted dandelion in your coffee along with chicory. These are things that provide a slightly bitter tone that helps stimulate digestion, like an aperitif would. In Eastern traditions, these tonics, they tend to be a process, right? We talk about tonifying deficiency, and deficiency can be in blood deficiency, chi deficiency. I don't really have time to go through all those concepts right now. It's a different medical system, but it has some overlap in what we try to do in terms of putting products together. But this is by building or nourishing, and they're going to tend to be sweet tasting herbs. So something like Panax ginseng or Angelica sinensis, that's Dong Quai. And oftentimes in the formal, TCM has a formal approach to formula where you have king and queen herbs and you have helper herbs. If you're going to have a sweet herb like Panax ginseng, which is sweet, and in this case it's rich in saponins, steroidal saponins. If you take a good tincture of ginseng and you shake it up, you should see a foaming action. But that's hard on your digestion. It doesn't digest really well. So what you'll find is something like bitter orange in there, because it has a bitter quality that'll cut through that kind of soapy, rich sweetness. And so, again, we not only formulate to treat specific conditions, but we formulate to enhance qualities of herbs, or to maybe potentially ameliorate a particular quality of an herb, that if it's one of the primaries and therefore the dosing of it is larger, we want to tone back the potential side effects. And that's really referred to as synergy in terms of building a formulary. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then finally, tropho-restoratives. These come out of the naturopathic traditions that really sort of originated in European sort of health movements. And this is about balancing organ and systems, either balancing excess or balancing deficiency. It can be used long-term to restore normal function. And a lot of these herbs are going to be rich in minerals. So there's a nutritive quality to each of these. And you can see the association of different herbs with systems, like the nervous system for Dhammayana, licorice for the endocrine system, that's hormonally based. Burdock, great on the skin. And again, you've seen some of these before. And then some of these are very unique. These are going to tend to be herbs that have a longer history within European traditions, because that's where the treatment approach originated from. So let me just stop there real quickly and see if there are any questions that might have popped up. And then we're going to go into what the next steps are going to be in this talk. I love questions, so don't hesitate. Don't feel shy. Whatever question you have is one that someone else in the room has as well. Okay, I'm not seeing one, so I'm just going to keep rolling here. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose a condition. And I'll differentiate a little bit when we get there about what's different between how a clinician might work versus a product developer. And then we're going to perform something of a deep dive, not super deep, but deeper than the rest on one plant, just really to show you a little bit about the clinical evidence in primary peer-reviewed literature. We also use traditional literature as well, but you really have to be able to be strong enough to discern the quality of that information, whether it's from science or tradition. That's one of the things that we do. We really build a strong base in understanding peer-reviewed literature, but we also build a base in terms of understanding how do you do gap analysis. Gap analysis being there's strong evidence in traditional literature, very little in science. What's the confirmatory approach that makes us feel secure around what's coming from tradition? Because just like any other place, tradition passes on bits of knowledge that are assumed to be true and often never get questioned. And one of the strengths of our program is that we ask you and encourage you and require you to question everything, because you have to. Otherwise, you'll be working with weak or incomplete information. So after we get that condition, we're going to do a deep dive on this one plant. We're going to touch on a second, and then we're going to provide the context for what drives product development. There's a lot of things, right? We're just kind of coming up with ideas from formulary, but there are a bunch of other things you need to think about, and we'll just briefly touch on those. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you all to come up with the third herb and your reason for it. And so we'll see what pops up. So here is the targeted condition, right? These are different types of herbs that you might find in an adaptogenic or resilience-based formulary. And we're going to focus on me, academic life, right? Long hours, a lot of mental work. You need to be able to sort of do a lot of thinking and not lose your focus. And you need to be able to continue to investigate and sort of not fall in the pattern. So there is a certain kind of curiosity or play. Think about the play of a child. This is true of many professions, right? If you can play, then you're going to do so much more than if you are just doing it because you have to do it. So in this condition, we're going to look at anti-fatigue, and we're going to look at cognitive-based enhancements from a resilience point of view. So two of the herbs that we're going to look at Bacopa monera. The main compounds in there are the bacchosides. These are triterpene saponins. We also refer to them as glycosides. These are terms about the structure of the chemistry. And I'll just briefly give you an idea of what that means. Glycosides refer to a compound, an aglycone, that has a sugar attached to it. Oftentimes this is done because the sugar will often provide more polarity, allow greater solubility in water. And this is how the plant stores it. It wants to be able to store a bunch of it to defend itself. So it wants to increase the concentration of these compounds that can be stored in storage vessels in the plant, and they're filled with a watery substance. Triterpenes are part of the terpenes tend to be nonpolar. They tend to be more like oils. You know them as the volatile compounds in essential oils, which are monoterpenes. Triterpenes are a little bit more complex. Saponins really refer to a steroidal structure where you're looking at a four-ring structure that is the basis of steroids, but we see them in plants as well. So this is where the naming comes from. They can have multiple names, and they refer to different characteristics of that phytochemical. Rhodiella will be the second one, and there you have these phenylpropanoids and their derivatives. These phenylpropanoids, again, will also be sort of what I would call empiphatic amphiphatic. They're like triterpene saponin, some of them that have sugars attached, meaning that they have the capacity to get dissolved in a more oil-based set of solutions, and an aqueous or water-based, because they have different characteristics. They might have one side of the compound that has a charge associated with it, which like water, and the other, which is very carbon rich, which tends to be what they call hydrophobic, afraid of water, and therefore more likely to dissolve in oil-based substances. So to the extent that we have to think about how do you combine these extracts into a similar solution, these two will be a little bit easier than if you had compounds that were highly water soluble and very non-water soluble. So here's a brief look at Bacopa. It has a number of properties to it. Antioxidant, you can see, so this does a number of things. It helps with the fatty insulation of the brain, sort of prevents lipid peroxidation. The SOD is anti-stress, antioxidant, and then reducing cell stress, right? Preserving memory function. And then you have neuroprotection, and you have modulation of neurotransmitters. And you can see, looking at those, all the different activities associated with those. So something like the HSP70, these are molecular chaperones or folding catalysts. And what we're talking about is chaperoning or folding proteins. And proteins, in this case, probably are enzymes. They're part of some catalytic function where they are changing a molecule from one state to another, potentially activating processes in the body. Here, in restoring lipid content, you're actually looking at things that help with Parkinson's, protecting cell membranes from beta amyloid buildup. So there's a bunch of mechanistic reasons for why the Bacopa tends to have this impact on mental acuity. But let's look at some studies and see in particular. So what I want to point out to you here is that, oops, I see a Q&A. Slide showed horsetail for long-term use, yet Materia Medica indicates it could be harmful. The horsetail, it depends on the use of it. So I think the susceptibility to some compounds in horsetail, you're going to have to be aware of. So I think horsetail can be used long-term, but there are going to be folks that maybe have susceptibility to kidney stones, and they're going to be sort of a subgroup where you say, look, you need to kind of cycle off and cycle back on, if that makes sense. So here we have a clinical trial that's been randomized. So we're looking at bias in all this, right? Double-blinded, meaning both participant and the people that conduct the study don't know what the treatment is, and placebo-controlled, so that they can make a statement about whether the effect was placebo-based. And here we're looking at the use of a standardized extract, meaning that they are claiming 40 to 50% bacicides in each of the capsules. And they give you a dosing. They have healthy participants is what they're dealing with, over 55 from the general population. They give you how many completed the trial, which is important. If you had a low completion rate, you might want to question the strength of this trial. Excuse me for a minute. I just need a sip of water. And now here are a number of validated, what we call validated instruments, things that have been validated to test particular functions. And they serve a number of purposes. One, when you're seeing an herbalist as a clinician, they're going to take in data and make some clinical decisions based on this conversation with you. When we look at sort of community-based or epidemiological data, right? The population, we're looking at consumers. We need to be able to have some kind of data coming in from multiple people. And we need to understand that there's a certain specific underlying functionality of a condition we want to treat. And also these validated instruments, they can be compared then. You can have another study with a different product of Bacopa and run the same study, same instrument, and now you can compare them. And this is really important over time as you begin to aggregate the data coming from a lot of different studies. You can get some interesting data. Now, clinicians could do something along the lines of case studies here. There's something called an N of 1 trial. And that's basically a case study where you control for a number of factors, such as what instrument are you using to diagnose. And when you do that, then you can get a bunch of case studies together, kind of clump them in and say, I can treat this as if it was a clinical trial because I've controlled for a number of factors. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to go from all the individual issues that make us unique humans, and therefore in a clinical setting requiring a unique set of solutions, to a population level solution to a problem that can be measured and defined. This is where this comes in and becomes important. This is where in our coursework, but also once you get out in the marketplace, you really need to be able to define your condition as it pertains to a population level. So you can't just call it depression. What kind of depression? We're talking about mild depression. How did you come up with that measurement? Are you using the Hamilton D scale? So in doing that, what you can do is then define the parameters of success for your formula for a certain subset of the population. You're not trying to help everybody. That's one of the silver bullets of herbal medicine that we want to avoid. We can help a population of people, and we're going to define what that population would look like, and we're going to formulate to that population. So here they were doing screening, neurophysiologic, and subjective memory assessments at baseline and then out at 12 weeks. And what ended up happening is they improved the visual spatial ability and visual memory. Now, this is something, again, we go back to our condition, right? Academic life. This is going to be very important to us. Here's another double-blind placebo-controlled trial. It was not randomized. So again, this weakens some of the study strength. They're using a different product, Keen Mind. This is standardized to 55% pesticides. We've got 107 healthy participants that were recruited, a lower percent that completed the trial. So again, here you might look at it a little bit differently. And they looked at cognitive research assessment system. These were neurophysiological testing at baseline in 90 days. Remember, the previous one was 12 weeks, right? That's almost about the same time. So there's enough in common that you could make potentially some comparisons. Here they improved the spatial working memory, accuracy, and sustained attention. And the other thing, let me just go back here. They were using 2 times at 150, right, dosing. This was 1 time 300 milligrams a day. So the same amount, but in a different dosing system. This becomes interesting as you begin to formulate, because you can now go back and say, would this have worked with only 150 mg a day, or was 2 required? What is my dosing going to look like? Now here you have, again, that non-randomized, double-blind, well, excuse me, it is randomized, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled. And here you have 2 different dosing regimens depending on the mass, the size of the person. 300 mg for 90 kilograms less than, and 90 kilograms is probably around 190 pounds, 450 milligrams above. And they used a dried root powder, so they weren't standardized to the bacicides as the other 2 were. And you had 76 adults with this age range They didn't provide how many were enrolled and how many completed. And they were using, a different set of instruments again. And they were tested prior to and the end of the trial, 3 months, 90 days, similar time frame, as well as 6 weeks after trial completion. So they did have a follow-up. And their results is that they had a significant effect on the retention of new information. They didn't see any change in attention, in verbal or visual short-term memory, retrieval of pre-experimental knowledge, or anxiety. So not the same visual effect that we saw in the other studies. Now, rhodiola, there is a proprietary extract, SHR5, where we see a lot of clinical trials. What we see in rhodiola is that improvement in physical fitness, mental fatigue, neuromotor tests. A single high dose provides a significant pronounced anti-fatigue effect. Multiple high doses improves burnout and mental performance indices. And you tend to get a reduced cortisol levels an hour after treatment. Cortisol is associated with stress response. And this looks like it might be, because of its focus on mental fatigue as well as physical performance, it might be a nice adjunct to the Bacopa. So I'm going to point out to you right here, give some thought. What would you suggest as that third herb? And as you're suggesting that, I'm just going to go over some of the next steps. And as you're ready or feel confident, just post it in the chat. Which herbs and why? What are you trying to accomplish with that third herb? Is there something synergistically going on? Any thoughts that you might have to share? So when we talk about product development, right? Other things you want to think about, not only defining what is the population you're treating and what's the condition, but does that product already exist in a form or a dose? How are you going to be different? Are you going to have a similar form, or are you going to actually go to, instead of a tincture, you're going to make a gummy? Instead of having an inhaled product, you're going to have a patch. So those are some of the considerations. In general, this is from the course, so obviously you're not limited to these number of herbs, but in general, you don't want to get too many herbs. If you're getting too many herbs, your condition is probably too broad, or you're trying to do too many things at once. But basically, what's a rational choice for 2 to 3 primary herbs and 1 to 2 secondary herbs? Right? The secondary herbs provide support, like the bitter orange with ginseng. What are the synergistic elements? Something like black pepper is often found with turmeric because it enhances the absorption. You have elements that might reduce toxicity. You have elements that maybe enhance a particular endpoint. So you want to look at those synergistic capacities. You want to have a safety profile. Are there herb-drug interactions, herb-herb interactions to be aware of? Any special populations that might be a risk? Children, older people, pregnancy. It might be something as similar as if you are on birth control pills and you're taking an herb that impacts the cytochrome P450. It's a type of enzyme that is responsible for how long certain compounds stay in your body and how quickly they get into your body and therefore affect the therapeutic dose, right? If you've got an herb that also impacts that, maybe makes it work faster for something like blood thinners or chemotherapy or birth control, it may mean that you're actually dropping the amount that's in the blood down below a therapeutic dose and it's not having the appropriate effect. So those are things you want to be looking at for. You want to rationalize your extraction and your blending methods. Right? We talked about Bacopa and rhodiola having a similar solubility profile, but you're going to end up with herbs that have very different profiles. How do you bring them together? Are you going to use emulsion technology, micro emulsion technology, nanotechnologies? Are you going to end up using vinegars that alter the pH, or add glycerin to sort of change some of the aqueous content into something less aqueous? So there are a lot of ways to go there. What you need appropriate structure function claims. You can't say echinacea will cure COVID. You can say echinacea helps support a healthy immune system. So these are things that the FTC and the FDA are going to look at. You need to look at, well, how does this absorb? Does this absorb well? Turmeric by itself, maybe, or turmeric in a nano structured form probably is not going to absorb super well. In Ayurvedic medicine, you find turmeric with ghee, which is lipid soluble. It's going to enhance the solubility of the turmeric, along with black pepper, which is going to increase how much goes across the gut. Matrix effects, if you put cannabis in with chocolate, and you're going to have certain label claims on it. There are these phenolics in chocolate that will bind to THC, CBD, and other cannabinoids in such a way that your product, if you run it through an analytical device, it'll show less than what you claim on your label. So you need to be aware of that. Stability. Once you make your product and you have it sitting on a shelf, how long is it going to be viable? Are these compounds going to break down? How can I stabilize them? Is light going to do it? Heat? And then you want to rationalize your dosage form. Posology is the amount of dose. You want to name your product, right? You're going to create packaging. And there's a whole bunch of business stuff that goes along, right? Everything from where are you selling it? What's your business plan? What's your marketing plan? What's your rollout plan? What's your branding? All these things. So we actually have a course that I'm completing the development of now, which is around the business of herbal products, so that you're armed with that. You begin to understand where your financing is going to come from. How do you go out to investors and get them interested in your product? So these are all things that are part of that process.